This is Catherine Connors, and I'm quite honored to have her on the show. She's a writer based in LA, if I get that correctly. And I stumbled upon an essay that she wrote in the anthology called The Pious Sect. It is titled Love and Piety in Machiavelli's Mandragola. So I've been wanting to tackle Machiavelli for quite some time. So this is, I think, a lovely start. Catherine, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. Good. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. Yeah. So tell me a bit about your background as a writer and philosophy person.
Sure. But in a previous life, I did graduate work in political philosophy and taught as a sessional at the University of Toronto. My area was political philosophy in the Department of Political Science. And I had a special interest in sort of ancient through modern thought and a particular interest in how different thinkers tackled the question of storytelling and how they used different forms of storytelling and how they played with different types of stories in order to make sometimes what I think of as sort of radical political arguments. And Machiavelli fell very squarely into that arena. So I did a bit of work on Machiavelli. I left academia formally some years ago when I moved to the US and fell into the media and entertainment business and worked for the Walt Disney Company and have done a lot of my own writing.
That's cool. So, what are often your writing topics?
My writing topics are primarily around storytelling and storytelling for impact, how stories shift, how we look at the world, and especially how we look at how we understand who gets to participate in the public sphere. That's been a consistent thread for me. And even when I was at the Walt Disney Company working on things like fairy tale and princesses, a driving core question for me was how are these stories shaping how we think of what does a hero look like, a heroine? Uh-oh, I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry, we got a little interrupted. So, yeah, I think you mentioned working at the Walt Disney Company. So, what did you learn from it?
I mean, the biggest lesson was a very hands-on immersive lesson on how stories really do shape culture, and especially how stories at scale shape culture. And it was interesting for me having never expected to end up in the entertainment industry, never mind the Walt Disney Company, having had my origins as a political scientist and a political philosopher, having that intellectual history of my own, encounter the sort of the arguably the biggest cultural institution of storytelling of our time was a profound experience. If Machiavelli was tackling questions about and the Catholic Church and Christianity and republics, I was tackling the entertainment institutions.
I see. Yeah. So, do you still engage in political philosophy or the profession of your previous life in your own time?
Um, I suppose only really informally. I do a lot of work in teaching and advising around storytelling. And so there's the threads that I would argue are deeply political and deeply philosophical, and that absolutely pull on the history, of my graduate work and of my academic work, because so much of my current work looks at the influence of folklore, fairy tale, myth, and imagines like what are new forms of fairy tale, folklore, myth we might tell, what are the stories that shape not just our political beliefs, but our social and spiritual beliefs. There's very much that continued influence. I'm still very much influenced by the study that I did on thinkers like Machiavelli, Nietzsche, Rousseau, and before them, Plato, Aristotle, and others.
Got it. Okay. So, does Machiavelli's the Mandragola, is it a successful example of storytelling for impact?
Well, what I think it's a loaded question with Machiavelli about what, we could start with the what even is would impact have been for Machiavelli. I was trained in a school of thought and still very much, an adherent to the idea that thinkers like Machiavelli in their own time, much like, some thinkers and writers and storytellers in our own time, had to be careful about how they shared their ideas, not just because they were dependent on patronage, but because of the politics of the time. So I think Machiavelli was less about direct impact and more about influence. And he used a variety of writing tools, from, the longer works like the Discourses on the Republic to the shorter works that, may or may not have been satirical, like The Prince, as well as plays and letters, to advance his ideas in a way that were subtly influential and that I think have had impact later on.
Yeah. So I'm guessing you're talking about the Straussian school, right?
I'm talking about the Straussian school, yes.
Yeah, it's I've had a few Straussian people on this very program. The most important one that I've had is Professor Harvey Mansfield of Harvard.
Ah,
Yeah,
Harvey Mansfield, Mr. Mansfield was absolutely an influence on my work. And I think you've read the essays that I wrote, and I cite his own work on Machiavelli in it.
of course. And I should also mention that I this new collection of his essays also
Mhm.
has the essay in question that you cited. The was it the cuckold in Machiavelli's Mandragola?
Yes. Yeah.
So I should ask you to sort of like provide a description of Machiavelli's works, this work of his, because it's one of his lesser known written works. Most people know of The Prince. Those who dive deeper into Machiavelli's philosophy would know of the Discourses. But of course, the Mandragola is a dramatic work, but it's also a philosophical work. So tell me more about it.
Yeah, no, a philosophical work for sure, and a literary work. He did, Machiavelli, he has another play, the Clisia. Machiavelli really, really explored a variety of forms. And as you say, his most famous, work is The Prince. Slightly less famous, but certainly well known among who reads beyond The Prince is the Discourses. And then we have his plays, and there are, of course, letters and, other works of writing of his. The Mandragola is a comedy, and he's very, very, very clear that it is a comedy. And, as I think, he's really trying to pay attention, to draw our attention to the fact that in this play, through which he's interrogating, at the core, a very famous story, and he's interrogating some of his own ideas, he's asking us from the outset to look at it as a work of humor. And I think he's not asking us to look at it as a work of humor, haha, right? That it is not like this is not a Shakespearean comedy where we are meant to just slap our thighs and laugh. That what he is asking us to do is to appreciate that his tongue is very firmly in cheek, and that he is asking us to look at the subversive elements of the story. So the story, arguably, I certainly argue, and others have argued, directly references the very famous story of the rape of Lucretia, which is a very famous story in the history of Rome, in which a virtuous woman is raped. And because of that, a series of events lead to the fall of the Tarquin aristocracy and lead to the rise of a republic. And so it's often cited, and Machiavelli cites it in his Discourses on Livy, in a few places, as a story that points to the founding of a republic. Machiavelli's not alone in being very interested, obviously, in the founding of republics, but he spends a lot of time in his work looking at what are the dynamics that create new political orders. And anyone who's read The Prince will think of like new modes and orders. He's very interested in what makes a political order and a political culture emerge. The story of the historic Lucretia and the rape of Lucretia, lots of art around this. It's a subject of a lot of artistic, literary, and philosophic attention. Machiavelli here in the Mandragola turns into a different kind of story. He changes the characters, he takes the sort of basic plot of a sexual dalliance, and creates a different story that I think tells us something slightly different about how he thinks about the emergence of republics, how he thinks about the emergence of new political orders, and especially how he thinks about virtue or virtu.
So what is virtue and how is it different from virtue?
Well, anyone who's read The Prince or certainly studied The Prince, and especially if you have studied it with any Straussians, know that Vertu is a cornerstone of the philosophy of The Prince. And whether you read The Prince through a Straussian lens or whether you read The Prince through a direct lens, you have to pay attention to how Machiavelli frames Vertu, which he always puts in this Latinate construction. He, of course, is originally writing in Italian, the translations are English, but he's insistent upon Vertu as opposed to virtue, conventionally understood. And the Prince, he really acts to posture. It's been translated or it's been interpreted. Mansfield does a lot of this as a form of manliness. My own work back when I was still much more, formally embedded in academia, looked at the distinctions made between virtue and manly is most straightforwardly described as the, we could describe it as an ability to navigate fortune, an ability to control one environment. It is, as we understand it, the sense of being really good, right? It is virtue in the sense of being effective, of being effectual. And so there's this distinction that is certainly Machiavelli's influenced by from the early Roman context, where vertu, the word, comes literally from the root ver, which means manly. We can say virtue etymologically simply means manliness. That Machiavelli's vertu framed as a kind of moral virtue with women in context is using the Latin word pudicitia, right? Which for women meant to female virtue or feminine virtue was to be private, to be modest, to be shamed, like not in the sense of like shaming that we mean it, but in the sense of having a sense of one's own modesty and a sense of the importance of being a private person. So when the historical Lucretia gets raped, right, it's a violation of her pudicitia, right? It's a violation of her status as a pure and private woman. The Lucretia in Machiavelli's Mandragola, and we can unpack this a little bit more, is also framed initially as a feminine virtue. I argue in the essay that what we see unfold in that play is a blurring of the lines for Machiavelli between feminine virtue. Arguably, the character in the play who most embodies Machiavelli's idea of virtue or princely virtue is, in fact, the female character.
Okay. Well, since you characterized the Mandragola as a comedy, so who is the comic figure?
The comic figure, through the traditional historic lens, is Nisia, Lucretia's husband. So the basic plot of the play is that there is this beautiful, beautiful, reputationally exceedingly beautiful young woman named Lucretia. This echoes the historic Lucretia of the Rape of Lucretia, whose beauty was famed far and wide. Lucretia is married to a much older man named Nisia, who badly, badly, badly wants children. They are not producing children for reasons that Machiavelli sort of makes some jokes about, but it's clear through the jokes that Machiavelli makes that this older man who badly wants children is not able to sleep with his wife. She's avoiding him. She's using her virtue, her need for prayer as a way to avoiding sleeping with him. And he's not having children. And so right away from the outset, we start to get the stage of like this poor older man, right? who badly wants children, is very, very proud of his beautiful wife, but can't sleep with her, right? She's inaccessible to him, is already in, if this were Shakespeare, a very obviously comic character. What unfolds throughout the course of the play is this plot by a character named Calimico, who hears about Lucretia's beauty and travels across the world to see her beauty, decides that he wants to sleep and advise her to sleep with her, effectively cuckolding Nisia, right? And this is Mansfield covers this as well. It's a mainstay of Renaissance and early modern comedy, and it's a mainstay of our own comedy now, that the most ridiculous position that a man can be in is to be cheated on by his wife. And the Mandragola's entire plot revolves around this plot to cuckold Nisia.
Yes. course. And I wonder because there are two Lucretias that Machiavelli is alluding to. One is the Roman Lucretia, who is
Yeah.
virtuous, as the Romans would have you believe, and
Yeah.
Lucretia Borgia, who is less than virtuous, rather scandalous, really.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So, to what extent is this Lucretia in the play The Mandragola? To what extent is she a representative of both women?
I think she's absolutely a representative of both, right? There's no way she's not a representative of both. The Borgias were very, very a huge part of the landscape of Machiavelli's life and his career. I mean, the dedication of the prince is to the Borgias. So the famous and famously unvirtuous Lucretia Borgia is, of course, on his mind, right? And the use of the name Lucretia is absolutely meant to remind us not just of the ancient Roman Lucretia, but the Lucretia of Machiavelli's own time. And you're exactly right that they are polar opposite Lucretias, right? This is not an accident for the purposes of storytelling that we have one who is famed in art and philosophy and literature and music as the most virtuous woman of her kind, right? Who gets violated. And then we have another who is notorious for being unvirtuous. And Machiavelli creates this third Lucretia in the middle, who I believe, and I argue in my essay, is meant to combine the elements of those different forms of virtue. If we can imagine Lucretia Borgia as a woman possessing masculine virtue, a sort of manliness in her openness to vice, right? In her openness to being flexible with her morality. And the other Lucretia as being very pudica, as being very feminine in her virtue. The Lucretia of the Mandragola, I believe, Machiavelli as is inviting us to see as not sitting in the middle in the sense of like she's a little bit of one, little bit of the other, but as a character who is combining the powers of both.
Got it. So I believe the representative of the church is Brother Timothy, the religious figure who basically
Yes.
advised Lucretia to follow through with the plan to sleep with Callimaco. So to what extent is this character a sort of like a satire of the church during Machiavelli's time?
Well, I mean, he's absolutely a big old nod, right? He is representative very literally of the church. And remember, it's both him and Lucretia's mother who become these interveners. And I think we're absolutely meant to understand that Lucretia's mother herself is not pudica, right? She's not a virtuous woman. So we're getting all these signals about people of dubious morality. Brother Timothy, Father Timothy has dubious morality because he is engaged in this plot. Both he and Lucretia's mother are interested in pursuing their own ends. And so they engage in the plot because it's going to get them what they want. So we can see right away that the church has a figurehead in the mix in this, right? In this individual who's participating in the plot and trying to achieve his own ends. And I think it's an interesting question to consider whether Machiavelli considers that character to be sort of the sole reference to the church, right? Like that this is just a very conventional Machiavellian nod to the church's corruptibility and to the church being a political institution, to being politicized, or whether we're meant to see that very obvious nod, right? Comic, right? This is the part of the value of comedy is that it gives us plausible deniability around real criticism. So if we put anything under the veil of ha ha ha, we're just making a joke, we can get away with saying all sorts of outrageous things. And, it's a bit of an outrageous thing to say that, that this priest is corruptible. I also think, however, that Machiavelli, through the course of the play, is making a larger point in the character of Lucretia herself and in that malleability of virtue itself that points to a similar reading of the church, but one that is a little bit more nuanced.
Yeah. And since we're talking about Lucretia Borgia, her father Rodrigo became Pope, Alexander VI. So Machiavelli does have a veiled criticism of the church in particular and Christian morality in general in throughout his works, but he also shows a fondness or a defense of the republican form of government, um,
Mhm.
mostly inspired by the Romans. So, do we get a sense in the Mandragola that this advocacy comes through?
Well, I think the way to frame Machiavelli's admiration's plural, that Machiavelli's interested in what's effective or effectual, right? So Machiavelli, if Machiavelli were here in our own time, he would be looking at the social, cultural, political landscape and asking, what's going to work best, right? How do we navigate this moment in time with the most effective means? He is partial to republics, right? He is a modern thinker, like I'll put scare quotes around that, in that he is very interested in political new modes and orders of governance and of politics and of political community. But he's also very, very, very strategic, right? So he's very critical of the church, right? He's very critical of Christianity and he's very critical of the Catholic Church. But I would also argue that he's something of an admirer, that these are politically effective institutions. And so we see in The Prince, for example, when he distinguishes between armed and unarmed prophets, right? Jesus Christ is an unarmed prophet. He's just got his words and his ideas and his influence. The church has arms, right? The church has all the ideas and the influence, and it's got might, right? It's got force, it's got political heft. So when we think about what Machiavelli's advancing an agenda, I think it's for us to look at how in ways that are deeply, deeply strategic, right? You know, the term Machiavellian, as you know, has come to mean like refer to sort of a kind of nefariousness, but it really doesn't. Machiavellian in the Machiavelli sense, in the sense of virtue, is simply to strive to be effective, right? And if your objective is to build and support the emergence and scaling of republics, then the best you can, I think this plays out pretty clearly in the Mandragola. If the news that you want, then you need to think about how cunning you need to be to get it.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the title of the play, the Mandragola. It translates to mandrake, and it signifies the object that is at the center of the play, a root that I believe Lucretia, the character, would consume, and that would provide Callimaco in some ways is an aphrodisiac, I think, right? Callimaco would engage in relations with her, but then he would die as a result. But of course, he didn't die. So, what does this object represent?
It's such an interesting one, right? Machiavelli doesn't call the play Lucretia, right? He doesn't name the play after any of the characters. He calls the play, like the English translation is the mandrake or the mandrake root, la mandrake, right? It represents this plant. And if we want to layer in other plants, it's often associated with witchcraft, right? It's associated like herbal work has historically across cultures associated with women and associated with witchcraft, with the occult, with medicine to some degree, but usually the sort of the feminine of old wives' tales, right? So right away we have this medicine that's introduced, this plant, and it's something of a MacGuffin, right? In the parlance of contemporary screenwriting or playwriting, that this is it's not the core actor, but it's the mechanism through which the actors in the play get what they want. So Nisia is told that the only way and again, the play really leans on this absurd sort of comic frame of Nisia as like wanting children so badly that he'll kind of agree to anything. And he is convinced by Lihurgio, the doctor, by the Timothy, by Lucretia's mother, by all the players that if Lucretia takes if Callimaco takes this plant, if someone takes this plant, this aphrodisiac, this medicine, and sleeps with Lucretia, it's going to correct the infertility in some way. However, as you say, the whole plot hinges on this claim that we are never told, like, it's alluded that it's not really true because Callimaco can survive it. But this claim that the mandrake root will kill the person, the man who takes it and sleeps with Lucretia. So of course, Nisia is not going to take it. He doesn't want to risk his life, but he's quite happy to have someone else take her. So the mandrake is this dupe, right? It's this tool of deception. It's a tool of manipulation thing in this and allows characters who are in pursuit of that they want to this trick on the comic character, the foil in the story, and achieve their ends. It is an end. It is a means to an end that they all want to justify for themselves.
Okay. Well, at the heart of the play is a conspiracy, of course, just to impregnate Lucretia with the seeds of not Mr. Nicias's child. And
Mhm.
uh, I suppose if we can read that Calamaco is designated to be a fall guy, so to speak, in our modern day language. And of course, the conspiracy succeeded, and Calamaco lived to tell the tale, so to speak. What does it say about the nature of conspiracy planning in the world of Machiavelli? Does he believe that in order for a conspiracy to fulfill its purpose, there has to be a fall guy, and the fall guy may not know that he's a fall guy?
Well, I mean, in this case, I would argue that Calimico isn't a fall guy, right? Nicia, Lucretia's husband, is the fall guy, and this is where Harvey Mansfield and I disagree because he associates Messer Nicia as the Machiavellian character that ultimately he according to Mansfield, he's the largest beneficiary of all the events of the story. I think that Nicia is very clearly because he's the cuckold, like he's the one that gets fooled. That he really isn't. Calimico is an agent, let's say. Calimico really sets the whole plot going because he wants to sleep with Lucretia. He thinks she's pretty, right? It's very basic, right? And this is like, he wants to sleep with her. He's heard of her beauty. He sees her. He falls in lust. He wants to sleep with her. And then like all of the plot gets into motion. The conspiracy gets into motion in the first instance because this one guy wants to sleep with this one gal. And like this, of course, is a plot that we see over and over and over again in Western culture, but it's a very straightforward one. The thing of it is that Calimico, if we think of Calimico as the one who benefits from the conspiracy, right? He gets what he wants. He gets to sleep with her. But Machiavelli tells us through the play, he falls madly in love with her, right? And is willing to do whatever she wants. So we can look at it through the lens of, well, Calimico gets what he wants. He sleeps with her. Nicia gets what he wants because the infertility problem is solved. But by the end of the play, what we see is they're both in a vulnerable position. Calimico is in love with Lucretia and will do anything she wants. Nicia is so grateful that he's going to have children. He'll do whatever she wants. And she now is the person who holds all the cards. She then says to Nicia, he's like, I think we need to invite Calimico into our family, right? I think he needs to be one of us. I think he needs to be compare, right? One of us, a brother, a godfather. He needs to live in our household. So you look at what's happened by the end of the play. It's really quite extraordinary. And also Machiavelli says, like, after this night with Calimico, she's reborn, but she's also got more power over him. It's really pretty transparent in the text that Lucretia has come out on top. And she's got two men who are willing to do whatever she wants. And she convinces them that they should live in this polyandrous household together and have a family together. And effectively, right, this is where we come back to Machiavelli's new modes and orders. Lucretia, it turns out, has managed to take this whole conspiracy and architect a new mode of family. She's created a new political unit at which she's at the top. This family that defies the principles of the church, that defies the principles of her culture, but she's managed to get the best possible outcome, right? We can still say, yes, Nicia is going to get his kids, but he's been cuckolded, right? That's a pretty bad thing through most of history. Like, no man wants that are this theme in other places, right? You need to know who your kids are if you're going to have a legacy. Calimico is like the second man on the totem pole, right? He's now just the lover, he's the boyfriend. And well, there's a lot of people that would probably embrace that. It's still, he has not come into this with the most power. The person arguably who has the most power by the end of the play is Lucretia herself.
Well, to harken back to the title of your essay, Love and Piety. So,
Mhm.
where in the play does love come into the picture?
Love comes picture through the mechanism start to feel element of Lucretia Borgia, right? We get this sense of woman as a figure who can manipulate things to her own ends because men want her. right? She can use her feminine wiles, she can use her beauty, she can use the tricks up her sleeve, right, in order to manipulate things. She can use her cunning, right? Lucretia Borgia is like repeatedly characterized as cunning. Cunning is arguably a signal characteristic of the prince, of Vertu. The princely character, the character with Vertu, is the one who can navigate fortune, navigate a landscape, and bend it to his, or in this case, her will, right? So Lucretia arguably uses the arms of love, right? Love is a weapon in order to get what she wants, right? Calimico is entranced by her beauty and falls in love with her. Her older husband will do anything she wants because she's a beautiful younger woman. She uses this to create a new political order within the context of her own family. She uses the fact that they lust for her, that they love her, that they are vulnerable to her charms, that they are vulnerable to her enchantment, right? If we go back to, let's say, an argument that the mandrake is, is an herb of enchantment, she uses those things to get her own way.
All right. So I'm sure you've answered this already, but by this reading of yours, does that mean that women can also be princes?
I think so. This is the provocation. And Machiavelli nods to this in other places in his work. He's got a wonderful passage in the Discourses about Caterina Sforza, about Caterina Sforza basically duping an approaching army into her own escape by appealing to their preconceived ideas of who she is as a mother. Right. She begs for like release, from their, from their castle, saying, like, I'm not going to escape because I'm a mother, I have children, right? And then she gets out and she lifts up her skirt. And Machiavelli says she shows her parts and says, I can make more, right? And off she goes. Caterina Sforza, Lucretia Borgia, the Lucretia, the Mandragola. Machiavelli, I think, drops enough hints in these characters. When he does talk about women, he talks about them in the context of their cunning. Fortune is a woman, right? Fortune is a character, even though it's very symbolic and figurative, he's very, very clear that, like, Fortune's not to be messed with. Right? It takes really the most princely character to be able to navigate fortune. I think there is, again, I'm not saying that Machiavelli was an assertive feminist, right? What I'm saying is that for his time, Machiavelli was very alert to the unique capacity of women, female characters, to navigate complicated landscapes in cunning ways through manipulating the perception of their virtue. This is where we come back, I would argue, to a connection to Christianity and the church. Machiavelli is pretty clear, especially through Straussian readings of his work, that the Catholic Church's most important power is that it's able to convince people of its moral goodness while still being very political and sometimes violent. Right? The Catholic Church plays with virtue in a way that allows it to be armed, right? To use its arms. My argument is that when Machiavelli surfaces female characters, he's doing a similar thing, right? That he's and maybe he's using them as a way of signaling the bigger argument about the church and about Christianity as a political institution that uses cunning by manipulating ideas of virtue and morality. Or maybe he is proto-feminist, right? This is not very Straussian of me, but this is, he made early acknowledgement to the capacity of women to be princely.
Okay. Well, I have two final queries. One is, by paying this homage to the rape of Lucretia, Machiavelli clearly states that, the act of sex, whether taken by force or not, carries with it political consequences. So how are the political consequences manifest themselves in the play?
Well, I think in the play, the political are at the level of the household, right? This is a very controlled stage, right? Machiavelli is not telling a story about the broader political context of Lucretia, Nicias, Calimico's communities. But I think he is doing something that is very Aristotelian, right? He is saying household represents a political unit. It represents represents a kind of political organization that has rules, right? That has figures of authority, has expectations of obedience, that has its own orders. So my argument is that in the Mandragola, the political consequences play out in the household. So whereas in the rape of Lucretia in ancient Rome, this is the birth of a republic, right? This is this rape, this sexual incident, this compromise of virtue sets in motion a series of actions that lead to the downfall of the Tarquins and the rise of the Republic. In the Mandragola, we can look at it sort of microscopically and say that Machiavelli is painting a very, very similar series of events. But he's saying these are architected, these are strategic, these are the actors at the level of the Mandragola's political conspiracy are working at the level of the family. And the sex act that's at the core of the conspiracy becomes the catalyst for a similar series of events that leads to the fall of the paternal authority of Nicaea, right, as the masculine head of household, and actually creates a republic of sorts. It's a polyandrous household, right? This is polyamory. We've got now not just a conventional paternalistic Italian household with the man at the top and a subservient wife and subservient children. We have a Republican household where there is a female figure with a lot of authority sharing authority with a couple of men, an entirely new mode and order, not too far of a stretch to say is more Republican than aristocratic.
So finally, to what extent should we revise our popular understanding of Machiavelli and the term Machiavellianism?
I so wish we would revise it. I mean, as we've got so much of an association with of Machiavelli with, I mean, evil, right? Shakespeare used Machiavel as as another code word for Lucifer, for Satan. Machiavelli, as I said before, I think is about effectiveness and about strategy and about finding the best means necessary to achieve good ends, right? Machiavelli, as anyone who studies And Beyond the Prince knows, is pro-Republican, like wants to see the emergence of a new mode and order that breaks with a very conservative and static tradition. And I think it's a shame that, in our own time, because we've just so associate Machiavelli with the prince and we so imagine that he's just like the nefarious whisper in the ears of people who want to seize power, we forget that he's using storytelling very effectively to advance subversive ideas, right? Extremely subversive ideas, and to popularize at least the seeds of subversive ideas. So in our own time, I wish that we had this broader sense of Machiavelli as this creative person, not just a political advisor, but a philosopher and an artist, right? A playwright, a novelist, a person who worked in words and letters in order to advance radical ideas and challenge conventional thinking.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Catherine Connors, for joining the show.